Hello and a very good day a bit to all of you. We are from Group 6 and my name is Amira Akila binti Hanim with the metric number 208114 alongside with my team members Angelica and Lokeswari. Today we will be presenting about speech communities. So for today's presentation, I will start off with the introduction of speech communities and then we will move on to linguistic boundaries, and last but not least we will share to you about shared norms. So now let us start with speech communities. Let's start off with the definition of speech community. So a speech community generally is a group of people who share a set of linguistic norms and expectations with their regard to how their language should be used. A social linguist named Labov in 1972, he said that a speech community cannot be conceived as a group of speakers who all use the same forms. It is best defined as a group who share the same norms in regard to language, who also share a set of social attitudes towards the language. To understand better, in a speech community, they share a specific set of norms that is used through living and interacting with each other, and therefore may emerge among all groups that interact frequently and share certain norms and ideologies. So such groups can be villages, it can be countries, a community that shares the same hobbies or maybe shares the same lifestyle, or even just a group of friends. So speech communities, they may also share both particular sets of vocabulary and also grammatical conventions, as well as speech styles and genres, and also norms for how and when to speak in particular ways. Now, let us see the characteristics of a speech community. So first of all, a speech community is a group of people, means that it's more than two. It uses the same language, the same dialect, the same words, and they interact linguistically with each other. The second one is that they share a specific set of norms for language that is used through living and interacting together. Next one is that the members of the community, they speak more often with each other than they do with members outside of the community. And last but not least, face-to-face contact is unnecessary, means that they can communicate using text messages, using letters, and not just face-to-face. So now, let me give you some examples for speech communities. A typical speech community can be a small town, but Labov claims that a large metropolitan, for instance New York, it can also be considered as one single speech community. As that being said, we can say that all English-speaking people, they belong to a speech community, and the same goes to all German speakers. And we may also belong to several speech communities. For example, I speak both Malay and English, which means that I already belong to two different speech communities. So that is all from me. Now I pass the presentation to the next presenter, which is Lokeswari.
Hello everyone, I am Logeshwari Alumalai with metric number 206803. Today, I would like to present about the linguistic boundaries. First of all, I would like to give a definition about linguistic boundaries. Linguistic boundaries form between areas where people speak different languages. As Patrick and Morgan said, in sociolinguistics, we need a specific definition of a group in order to do research. The kind of group that sociolinguists have generally attempted to study is called the speech community. For purely theoretical purposes, some linguists have hypothesized the existence of an ideal speech community. This is actually what Chomsky proposes is completely homogeneous speech community. License offer a definition of what is called a real speech community. All the people who use a given language or dialect. However, that merely shifts the issue to making the definition of a language or of a dialect also the definition of a speech community. It's really quite easy to demonstrate that a speech community is not conterminous with a language. While, for the example, the English language is spoken in many places throughout the world, we must certainly recognize that it is also spoken in a variety of ways in speech communities that are almost entirely isolated from one another. For example, in South Africa, in New Zealand, and among expatriates in China. We must ask ourselves, in what sense does this modern lingua franca produce a speech community that might be interest to us? Furthermore, if speech communities are defined solely by their linguistic characteristic, we must acknowledge the inherent secularity of any such definition in that language itself is a communal possession. Speakers do use linguistic characteristic to etch group identity and group differentiation from other speakers, but they use other characteristics as well. For example, political, socio-cultural, and ethnic. We also note that a recognizable single speech community can employ more than one language, whether we use national boundaries to define it. For example, in Switzerland and Canada, all countries with more than one official language. Second, city or city-state designation. For example, in Berlin and Singapore, where multiple languages are used for everyday interaction and education. Last but not least, neighborhood boundaries. For example, in little village in Chicago, you can hear both Spanish and English. And in San Francisco Chinatown, both Cantonese and English are commonly used. That's all for about the linguistic boundaries. Next, I would like to invite Angelica to present about share norms.
Hello, my name is Angelica with the metric number 205448, and today I will be covering on the topic of shared norms. In Lebow's 1972 definition, he stated that a shared norm is when a speaker from a specific community will share a common feeling towards linguistic behavior in that community itself. And linguistic behavior here is also known as the linguistic norms. However, we must also note that speech communities are not in any way defined by any marked agreement in the usage of a language element. And Milroy 1987 actually shared the same understanding of what a shared norm is, because Milroy stated that different communities have different ways of understanding the shared linguistics. For example, New Yorkers would be able to understand other New Yorkers, but the British people would not be able to understand New Yorkers. However, we cannot also say that all British people would be able to understand other British people, because Britain is a very big country and there are many different speech communities that are situated in that country itself. Hence, the way one speaker speaks does not define how a speech community is actually formed. Next, I would like to touch upon the concept of a speech community. Well, a speech community is actually abstract. This is because the particular norms that are used in a community may or may not be exclusively linguistic in nature. Morgan 2001 stated that when people come together through discursive practices, they behave as though they operate within a shared set of norms, local knowledge, beliefs, and values. Now, what is discursive practices? Discursive practices is actually a theory of the linguistic and social cultural characteristics of reoccurring episodes of face to face interactions. And besides that, we can also link that the concept of a speech community is when speakers within a speech community itself shares a sense of social norms in discourse, and the variation of a language shows their identity or represents their identity. Gumprez 1971 has actually said that linguistic forms can be grouped into three categories: dialects, styles, and registers. Now, why are these three categories important actually? Because with these, the three categories here, we are able to define smaller speech communities from a larger speech community. For example, North American English. In North American English, there are also smaller groups. And by knowing these categories, we can identify these groups because they have their own interactions and their own norms, depending on whether they are in a religious community or they live in a specific region or their occupation. Besides that, the existence of certain shared norms for language, even if they do not share a linguistic system, is also possible. This is because of a term called Sprachbund. Now, Sprachbund is also known as a linguistic area, and it is a group of languages that shares areal features resulting from geographical proximity and language contact. So, for example, in Eastern Europe, many speakers of Czech, Austrian German, and Hungarian share rules about proper forms of greetings, suitable topics for conversation, or they have similar the similarity in some ways of pronouncing the letters, but they don't share a common language. So, because of this, we cannot really say that they are a speech community, but we can explain that they are a community that can be defined by certain areas of speech. So, with this, Gumprez came up with a conclusion. He stated that there are no a priori ground which forces us to define speech communities so that all members speak the same language. Meaning to say that even if you belong in a particular speech community, it doesn't mean that you need to speak the same language because, as I've stated before, even in larger speech communities, there are smaller speech communities within that big group that has different dialects, different ways of speaking. Their registers are different, their styles are different. So before we end our presentation for today, I would like to share a short video to further enhance your understanding of what a speech community actually is.
What are the different speech groups or communities that you are a part of?
I would say, I have my speech community with my close friends, speech community with new friends that I've met here at Charlotte, and I have speech community of my church. Obviously, the home speech community, the way I speak with my parents and family members.
And then I would say I'm part of the Southern speech community. That's where I've grown up all of my life. And then the business speech community, because interviewing for jobs and being a business major, that's a big part of my speech too.
I'm more of the technical communities altogether.
Do you notice when transitioning from one speech community to another that your speech has changed?
I can tell when I change from one speech community to another because I use very different terms when I'm working in class with the other computer science majors versus when I'm going back to my room and talking to my friends or roommate about what I did today.
I definitely think you can tell when I switch from being with close peers to obviously people who are in a leadership role or someone who's going to be evaluating how I'm speaking to them, if it's professional or if I'm speaking slang. Obviously I'm not going to try and speak slang to like a boss or anyone like that. So I definitely can tell when I'm talking to my friends and when I'm at work or different places that I change how I speak to other people.
A lot of my speech communities, they kind of combine together depending on what type of people I'm with. Other than like the business speech community and the athletic speech community, everything else, they kind of flow together and I use different words from the different speeches.
These are the references that we use or refer to actually create the slides today and to help us understand what speech communities actually are. And with that, it marks the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening.